Unrest in Venezuela. Uncertainty continues in the struggling country following an attempted military uprising. We have a report from Caracas. The Attorney General is in the hot seat. William Barr testifies over the Mueller report. We're on Capitol Hill. A helping hand. How a Catholic church is assisting in the aftermath of a deadly cyclone. And peace on earth. We'll preview the Holy Father's upcoming trip to Bulgaria and the connection the country has with a previous pope. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, May 1st, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Dwindling numbers of protesters continue to demand Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro step down. Hundreds gathered outside the Carlotta Air Base, heeding a call by opposition leader Juan Guaido for more protests. Masked protesters gathered on a highway, throwing rocks at the fort. The military fired back with tear gas. Maduro has accused Guaido of trying to stage a coup and says he will prosecute. Joining us now from Caracas, Venezuela, is Associated Press reporter Philip Crowther. Philip, welcome to our broadcast. Today's protests seemed anemic. What's happening now?
Yeah, there are big protests underway here in Caracas and indeed also in other parts of Venezuela, in all major cities and small ones as well. From what I've seen here in central Caracas, these have been largely good-natured protests. Of course, there aren't many at the same time, because essentially what we're seeing here is protests organized by the opposition in many different parts of the city that might well still converge later on in the same central area. And at the same time, there are also protests that were called by the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, so dueling protests, an oft-repeated story here in Venezuela today, protests that are for the opposition, then others for the current regime. They could still meet at some point and there could still be violent confrontations. For example, we've seen the effects of tear gas here in central Caracas. We've also heard what sounded a little bit, well, certainly sounded like gunfire. Now, I, of course, am hoping here that those are rubber bullets, but there are those sounds of protests and of clashes coming to us. But from what I've seen in person, most of it has been largely peaceful. A crucial moment, of course, for the opposition, because they really want to show that they are out in force. The opposition leader, Juan Guaido, after all, called for the biggest protests in the history of Venezuela. Can't tell you yet whether that is truly the case today here.
Well, Guaido released Venezuela's most prominent opposition activist, Leopoldo Lopez, from house arrest yesterday, and the two appeared at a rally. But today, Lopez is at the Spanish embassy, and there is speculation that he's seeking refuge. So what does this signal for the Guaido movement?
Well, as far as we know, this is not a case of political asylum, but still, it is a hugely important symbol that one of the opposition leaders, somebody who'd been in house arrest for a long period of time, came out yesterday morning for the first time in a long period and then disappeared again, essentially. Leopoldo Lopez appears to still be at the Spanish ambassador's residence. Now, when you try to organize a military change in a place like Venezuela, when you're looking for that upheaval, maybe not necessarily a coup d'etat, but something similar, it's not a good sign when one of your leaders disappears into one of the ambassador's residences, and that is the case for Leopoldo Lopez. So that is certainly something that would give the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, some of that optimism that we saw from him yesterday.
Philip Crowther, the Venezuelan government took CNN off the air yesterday after it broadcast a live feed of military vehicles running over protesters in Caracas. Have you had problems? How is this impacting daily life for Venezuelan people?
Oh, it's tough. It's not easy here right now. Let me just give you one example. The streets were completely deserted last night. I don't think I've ever seen, in fact, a capital city or indeed any other city so deserted. Now, that is partly, of course, because of that upheaval that we saw yesterday, starting in the morning and going all the way to the evening. There was so much uncertainty that people simply didn't leave their houses. Also, almost all the businesses were closed. Another thing that's worth remembering here, you've heard a lot about the hyperinflation, about the economic crisis here in Venezuela. It is incredibly deep. One example is the minimum salary. It used to be at $3. It's gone up to $7. That's not exactly much to get by with here on a monthly basis. This is a country that undoubtedly is in a very, very deep economic and financial crisis, and that explains at the very least in part what is going on right here. There is deep dissatisfaction, but there is also so much uncertainty because there have been many, many calls for change in Venezuela before. This might be one of the most vociferous, one of the strongest ones, this time coming from the opposition leader Juan Guaido. But a day like today might end up being frustrating for the opposition because clearly that big upheaval is not happening right now here in Venezuela.
Philip Crowther, international affiliate reporter for the Associated Press. Philip, thank you so much. The acting defense secretary abruptly cancels a trip to Europe, citing the crisis in Venezuela as one of the reasons. Patrick Shanahan says he will stay in Washington to coordinate with the National Security Council and Secretary of State. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee has more from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. So far, the Pentagon has not deployed any U.S. troops to Venezuela, and there's no American military operation in the works. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the administration is pushing for change to Venezuela's government through economic and diplomatic pressures. But the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says all options are on the table.
We're doing what we can now to collect intelligence, to make sure we have good visibility on what's happening down in Venezuela, and also be prepared to support the president should he require more from the U.S. military.
General Joseph Dunford tells members of Congress officials at the Pentagon are at the ready just in case. National Security Advisor John Bolton hopes American troops won't be needed.
We don't want to see a repeat of the violence of yesterday. We hope the people are not intimidated by the violence used against them.
Bolton says there's only one reason the communist president, Nicolas Maduro, is still in power: support from Russia and Cuba.
If this afternoon 20 to 25,000 Cubans left Venezuela, I think Maduro would fall by midnight.
Yesterday's widespread protests in Caracas were not enough to remove Maduro from power.
Ya están interrogando a todos los involucrados en estos eventos.
Maduro vows to punish supporters of Juan Guaido, who's called for more protests. He says his government refuses, quote, to surrender to the imperial United States. The Russian foreign minister strongly criticized Secretary Mike Pompeo during a phone call for interfering in Venezuela's internal affairs. This, one day after Pompeo told business executives that Maduro had a plane ready to fly him to Cuba, but held back after the Russians told him to stay, an accusation Maduro denies. Today, Maduro asked if Pompeo was serious about the accusation. The secretary promises the U.S. will stand with the people.
Please know that you have got a team, not just at the State Department, but in the intelligence community and in the military, who are very focused on protecting the Venezuelan people, restoring their dignity.
The Venezuelan bishops have been some of the biggest advocates for the poor and the sick, calling out the Maduro regime for not allowing humanitarian aid from the United States into the country. The bishops are wrapping up a 3-day meeting in their National Assembly this afternoon. They have not commented yet on this week's violent attempts to overthrow Maduro, but in recent months they've voiced their support for Juan Guaido. Lauren?
Great reporting. Thank you. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reporting from the State Department. Democrats blast Attorney General William Barr during a Senate hearing on Capitol Hill. It's the first time he is answering questions since the Justice Department released Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report about Russia's interference in the 2016 Trump campaign. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi gives us the highlights. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. Attorney General Barr says he's surprised Robert Mueller did not reach a conclusion on whether President Trump tried to obstruct justice. Now, Barr himself in March determined that the evidence does not establish that charge. He says the American people can now read the Mueller report, and if they don't like the way the president acted, there's another election in 18 months.
The main event for Washington and the country.
Mr. Barr, I feel your answer was purposely misleading, and I think others do too.
New worries on the part of Democrats after a revelation last night of what Special Counsel Mueller wrote Attorney General Barr in a letter March 27th. There is now public confusion about critical aspects of the results of our investigation. But why then did Attorney General Barr say on April 4th he was unaware of concerns from the Mueller team?
I don't know what you mean by related question. It seems to me to be a very different question.
I can't even follow that down the road. Boy. That's the masterful hair splitting.
Today, Barr said he did not lie. The concerns weren't from Mueller's team, but directly from Mueller.
And I asked him if he was suggesting that the March 24th letter was inaccurate, and he said no, but that the press reporting had been inaccurate, and that the press was reading too much into it.
Into Attorney General Barr's March 24th four-page summary of the special counsel's investigation. He wrote the president was cleared of collusion with Russia, and the special counsel could not determine if obstruction of justice took place.
When the Mueller report is put to bed, and it soon will be, this committee is going to look long and hard at how this all started.
Republicans say they want a full account of how this investigation was started and if President Trump was unfairly targeted.
These are the people that made a decision that Clinton didn't do anything wrong.
Democrats blast the grand old party.
I've been listening carefully to my Republican colleagues on the other side, and it appears that they are going to work together and coordinate the so-called lock-her-up defense.
Now, tomorrow, Attorney General Barr is scheduled to testify in the House, but the Department of Justice says Barr will not if the committee continues to insist that its lawyers do the questioning tomorrow. Democrats also want to question the special counsel, Robert Mueller. There's no word if or when that will happen. Lauren?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. Skirmishes between police and protesters broke out in Paris today as thousands of people gathered for May Day rallies, some protesting donations made to rebuild Notre Dame. Protesters were seen throwing stones and firebombs at police and smashing windows on a parked van. The tradition of May Day marches for workers' rights began in the U.S. in the 1880s. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is sentenced to 50 weeks in prison for skipping bail. The Australian had lived in the Ecuadorian embassy in London since June 2012 to avoid extradition to Sweden, where he faced sexual misconduct allegations. He faces a separate court hearing tomorrow on a U.S. extradition request. He's charged with conspiring to break into a Pentagon computer system. It's a new era for Japan as the new emperor inherits the throne. Emperor Naruhito inherited the imperial regalia today as part of the traditional ascension ritual, where for the first time a woman attended. A more extravagant ceremony is set for October. Naruhito became emperor after his father stepped down yesterday, ending a 30-year reign. He was the first to abdicate in 2 centuries. Another cyclone has hit Mozambique, and close to 1,000 people have taken refuge in a Catholic church. More than 22 inches of rain fell since last week. Many sought shelter at Mary Help of Christians Catholic Church, which is accepting hundreds of children and adults of all faiths. It's the first time 2 cyclones have struck the country in a single season. The government says the death toll has risen to 41. On Sunday, Pope Francis will travel to Bulgaria and to North Macedonia. The Catholic Church in Bulgaria has endured religious persecution for decades under a communist regime. Our Rome bureau chief, Alan Holdren, gives us a preview of the Eastern European nation where different religious communities now coexist peacefully.
In the heart of Bulgaria's capital of Sofia, you can find a mosque, a synagogue, an Orthodox church, and a Catholic cathedral. It's known as the quadrangle of religious tolerance. Bishop Christo Proikov says the majority of the population in a country of 8 million is Orthodox. 1 million are Muslims. Catholics total only 70,000. Francis will become the second pope to visit Bulgaria after Pope St. John Paul II. The theme of the trip is Peace on Earth, the title of a famous document written by another saint, Pope John XXIII. He lived in Bulgaria from 1925 to 1935 as the Vatican's representative, and he's left a legacy here. Father Yaroslav Babik, a priest at the cathedral, says locals call him the Bulgarian Pope. John XXIII's efforts to bring peace and unity haven't been forgotten in this former communist nation. The Sisters of the Eucharist built a convent and a church on land once owned by the Pope. they also lived in his old home.
Si vedi che dappertutto passiamo sui suoi passi.
Sister Massimiliana says it's moving to walk in the Pope's footsteps. In 1990, the communist regime fell, and in 2007, Bulgaria joined the European Union. This weekend, Pope Francis travels to Bulgaria for 2 days. He'll celebrate Mass in Sofia's main square and take part in a prayer service for peace with other religious leaders. On Tuesday, he'll travel to North Macedonia for the day before returning to the Vatican. In Rome, Alan Holdren, EWTN News Nightly.
Coming up, ahead of tomorrow's National Day of Prayer, we look at the relationship between Christians and President Trump. Alabama lawmakers vote overwhelmingly to ban nearly all abortions in the state. The Republican-led House voted 74-3 for legislation that would make it a felony to perform an abortion at any stage of pregnancy. The bill now moves to the state Senate. Tomorrow, the White House celebrates the National Day of Prayer. It comes as support for President Donald Trump among conservative Christians remains high. His pro-life policies are part of that reason. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. The president's defense of life in the womb is one of the main reasons he's seen that support. We looked at polls and talked to experts. Catholics are less approving of President Trump than Protestants, but tonight we take a look at why some Christians have backed the president and why that might not change in 2020.
Prayer has always been at the center of American life because America is a nation of believers.
And many believers in Jesus Christ have stood by the president since his election. A Pew Research survey shows 69% of white evangelicals approve of the way Trump is handling his job as president. And a new Morning Consult poll shows 55% of white evangelicals still want Trump to be the 2020 Republican presidential nominee. Experts studying faith and politics shared their own findings in Washington today.
Many Christian conservatives feel like they're under attack.
Coming to their defense, President Trump.
This guy seems to stand for us, and this guy claims that he's going to deliver the policy goods, and he has.
David Barker, a government professor at the American University, says Christians see a fighter in President Trump, even as critics see all his shortcomings.
The fact that Trump, right, is a philanderer and a liar and all these other things.
But Barker says many Christians acknowledge the sinful nature of humanity and the effect of original sin and could be more willing to forgive the president's personal faults. As for securing their votes, he says they're focused on the president's executive decisions.
The opportunity to replace 2, possibly 3 Supreme Court justices, and that can change abortion policy, right? And it can change a lot of other types of policies that they really care about.
Tomorrow, the National Day of Prayer will be celebrated in the Rose Garden. It is worth noting at last year's National Day of Prayer, the president announced the White House Faith and Opportunity Initiative. But nearly 360 days later, the White House still has not named an advisor to lead that effort. Lauren?
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. Up next, a proposed law in California is trying to force priests to violate the seal of confession. We have analysis. And the Pope's message to the faithful about the devil. A proposed bill in California would require clergy to report suspected cases of child abuse and neglect, even if they acquired the knowledge under the seal of confession. Current law provides for an exemption for penitential communications between an individual and their minister if the requirement of confidentiality is rooted in church doctrine. Joining me now by Skype is Charles Andry, President and Chief Counsel, Freedom of Conscience Defense Fund, an organization working pro bono to defend conscious rights. Welcome back to the program, Charles.
Thank you, Lauren. Good to be with you again.
This applies to all clergy, but it seems to put Catholic priests in a no-win situation. They either risk imprisonment or excommunication.
Exactly. It does apply not just to Catholics, but Catholics seem to be the target and have most to lose.
Supporters of the bill contend this is about protecting the health and the safety of children. What's your reaction to that argument?
No, I understand the argument, but this is certainly not the way to do it. You don't infringe upon a basic right of religious freedom, both under state law, as it's always existed for millennia, actually going back to England, where it recognized that there was a penitent clergy privilege, but also under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution and the California Constitution as well. There's religious freedom protection. So you don't violate someone's basic constitutional rights and statutory protections in order to serve another purpose, which for all intents and purposes would not be effective anyhow, because as you know, Lauren, the confessions are typically anonymous. A person certainly doesn't announce their name when they're confessing, and you wouldn't expect the priest to be grilling them so that they become an agent of the state in order to obtain information for some type of state prosecution. So this is not the way to promote protecting children, and there's no indication that the law would actually serve that purpose.
Well, it's interesting because if you're a priest and you don't see someone face to face, you're really a conduit between God and that person. Let's talk about this significance to religious freedom for both the priest and the penitent, and to people of other faiths. And how is this going to work?
Well, certainly from a spiritual perspective, there's eternal consequences of life here, because there's nothing more important to the Catholic person of faith. The seal of confession, of course, is a sacrament, and it's a way to expiate our sins through penance, and the priest is acting in the person of Christ in telling your sins to the priest, and he's acting in the person of Christ and giving you absolution. So it is profoundly important to devout Catholics and to people of other faiths as well, who have a similar type of rite or tradition in terms of confessing their sins to a minister in order to get some type of absolution.
The California Catholic Conference is voicing its opposition to the bill and urging other Catholics to join. It's cleared a state Senate committee, heads to appropriation, and then to the full floor. So, what is being done to keep this bill from being passed?
Well, as always, Lauren, with the lawmaking process, it's very important that people speak up at the front end and let it be known that their elected representatives are not acting in their interest by passing such legislation. However well-intended it may be, it's not going to serve its intended purpose, and it's going to violate fundamental rights, not just of priests, but the people who would be seeking absolution and confidence from priests through the process of a penitential communication. Again, Catholics certainly, but people of other faiths as well. So they should write their elected officials in the California state legislature, call them, let it be known that they vigorously oppose this type of legislation. Of course, if it passes, we'll be filing lawsuits to make sure that...
That's always the next step. Charles Lemandry, President and Chief Counsel, Freedom of Conscience Defense Fund. Thank you. Pope Francis reminded those who think belief in the devil is outdated, that Satan really does exist, and Jesus himself experienced temptations.
Non abbandonarci alla tentazione.
During his weekly talk at the Vatican, the Holy Father said Jesus confronted the devil and came out victorious. He urged the faithful to remember in their own moments of inclination that Jesus has already fought for us. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.